Hi, folks. Thanks so much for joining us. We're in the middle of a health crisis, and that's physical, mental, emotional, social, spiritual. It's a tough go for all of us. And on this program, we're going to talk with Dr. George Everly. He's a Ph.D. Psychologist, and he's connected with Johns Hopkins. The Johns Hopkins University Bloomberg School of Public Health. Doctor, good to say hello to you today. I hope all is well on your side of town.
Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be with you. And things are well here. Thank you.
When we're talking about the pandemic and we're talking about a kind of an overview of mental health, how are we doing? How are you doing?
Thank you for asking. I'm busy. This is, as the phrase goes, not my first rodeo. This is actually my third pandemic. But this is the most severe and the most challenging from many, many different angles. We actually have developed a bit of a gauge to assess what we call psychological toxicity. The ability of an agent, whether it's a hurricane, a terrorist attack, a tsunami, or something like this, a pandemic, we can gauge the relative psychological impact of these events. Mm-hmm. And while they sound very different in their agency, and they are, they follow actually a very predictable pattern, a psychological trajectory. And that's a good thing, because if it follows a fairly predictable pattern, we can gauge where we are at any one point in time, psychologically speaking, mm-hmm. and we can approximate how many psychological, we call them casualties, meaning someone who has been adversely affected in such a way that they just can't do what they need to do. The implications are rather staggering. The disaster mental health research has indicated that any given disaster is likely to generate 10 or more times psychological casualties than physical casualties. Now, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to do the math in our current state of affairs. This pandemic has affected millions of people physically. Take that by a factor of 10, and that's the implication that we're now looking at.
Mm. So when we see some numbers on the screen and they say 7 million cases, not counting the over 210 or 12,000 deaths, you're saying multiply all of that by a factor of 10? So we're talking about 70 million, which is a little under a quarter of our population, just in the United States.
I think that's a fair estimate.
And when you say there is a predictable pattern, I just find that so fascinating that you have laid it out for us in that way. What is the predictable pattern?
Well, it's based on some work done in the late 80s and early 90s, and my colleagues and I at Johns Hopkins have updated that research, updated that heuristic, I should say. So what we see, whether it's a pandemic or a hurricane, there's a phase that we will call the warning phase. Not all events have that, but we had somewhat of a warning that something was happening, something was potentially coming. Mm-hmm. Following the warning is the impact. This is where the agent, whatever it is, in this case, the virus, is manifest wherever we are. So that's in the United States. In looking at a tornado, for example, the impact may last 20 minutes. A hurricane, 24 hours. The pandemic, at least 6 months. And realistically, we're looking at this running longer, of course. So if we understand that chronicity of impact is one of the predictors of adverse psychological outcome, distress, if you will, we are in a new class of agent. So what you'd like to see in a disaster is a quick impact and a quick resolution in terms of the impact itself. A lingering impact is that much more psychologically toxic. The only thing worse than something that just lasts for a long time is something that comes in waves, and those waves might be unpredictable. So psychologically speaking, that's even more toxic than something that hits and stays around for a long time. I went to London and interviewed survivors of the London Blitz. And believe it or not, there are parallels. So in the London Blitz, the bombing was chronic over many days, many weeks, months, but it was very predictable. In the case of the pandemic, multiple waves, they are less predictable. So all of this is having an increased adverse psychological effect.
So when we are talking about a psychological impact, without me even identifying it, and specifically thinking about those 70 million people who you say are being impacted, I gather, rather dramatically, what is that psychological impact?
It will vary from person to person, but we can start with disbelief, sadness, depression, anxiety, fear. And sadly, if we lose people dear to us, and as John Donne would say, all people are dear to us, then we experience grief. And the longer, the more unpredictable, we may actually enter a sense of disillusionment and despair. My field, disaster mental health, is our job, basically, our goal is to shorten the duration of that disillusionment phase and to lessen its depth.
We will take a little break with Dr. George Everly, who is a psychologist connected with Johns Hopkins University's Bloomberg School of Public Health. Take a little break, back on the other side, and we're going to talk about psychological first aid. He wrote the book, A Guide to Psychological First Aid, that Johns Hopkins is identified with. So, back on the other side, This is America and the World. Underwriting for This is America and the World is made possible by the National Association for Children of Addiction, Faces and Voices of Recovery, the Forerunner Foundation, the Rotondaro Family Trust, the Sultanate of Oman, the Kingdom of Morocco, and the Embassy Series, Uniting People Through Musical Diplomacy. So, Doctor, let's start here and say, what's the concept of psychological first aid? The concept itself, the necessity of psychological first aid, and what's in the first aid kit, and just run with that as you choose, okay?
So the notion of psychological first aid is a derivation, I think, from the field of psychological crisis intervention. So it's not about making diagnoses. It's not about treatment per se. It's not about therapy. Psychological first aid is an analog to physical first aid. As we teach 18-year-olds to do physical first aid, in fact, we argue that physical first aid is actually an excellent life skill to have, isn't it? I mean, Shouldn't everyone have physical first aid training? I mean, you never know. You may save someone's life. So our point of view is that psychological first aid is almost as important and may be used actually more frequently. And can it be used to save a life? Of course. We are not talking about going to medical school or going to graduate school to learn this, as we don't require people to go to medical school to learn physical first aid. So think of it as simply a compassionate, supportive presence, which can be done as we are doing it virtually over the telephone or face-to-face. A compassionate and supportive presence designed to stabilize someone who's in acute distress, mitigate that distress, and if necessary, facilitate access to some other level of care. Now that sounds very academic, but let me walk you through the analog. So you come across someone who is bleeding. They have an arterial bleed. The first thing you must do is recognize it's an arterial bleed. Because if you don't know the difference between a laceration and an arterial bleed, you just put a Band-Aid on it, the person is going to die. So what do? Can we fix that arterial bleed? No, but we can stabilize it, can't we? We can put a tourniquet on it. We can keep it from getting worse. There may be something we can do to make it a little bit better, but what we will ultimately do is call 911, get this person to the emergency department, and that's where the cure will be employed. So if we think of psychological first aid, our job is not to diagnose other than to recognize the difference between a psychological laceration and a psychological arterial bleed. And again, not rocket science. Can we do something in the moment to help someone feel a little better? Can we at least keep them from getting worse? And if they require additional assistance that is beyond our toolkit, can we at least serve in an advocacy or liaison role? Can we help them get connected to other resources? And sometimes those resources are financial resources. Sometimes those resources are medical or psychiatric or psychological. Sometimes they may be actually spiritual. When I worked in the Middle East, people came to me with religious questions, knowing that my religion was not their religion. And yet, because they trusted me, they came to me. And my role was to get them to the type of guidance or care that I thought they needed, even though I was not capable of providing it. This concept is designed to complement therapy and psychiatric services. It is not designed to compete. And in fact, if I look at this from the 30,000-foot view, as a public health scholar would, our goal is protecting health, saving lives, millions at a time. That is the motto of the Bloomberg School. So even though I was originally trained as a clinician, I look at the world now a little differently. And I ask myself, can this thing, psychological first aid, actually have not just clinical value, but public health value? And the conclusion my colleagues and I have reached is that indeed it can. So if we are ever to approximate universal mental health care, I will say something a bit controversial perhaps. I will say we need to do something differently. The answer does not reside in training more psychologists and more psychiatrists per se, although that is important as well. Perhaps we can build psychological first aid into the fabric of every community. We can train teachers, firefighters, police officers. We can train emergency room personnel, first receivers, EMTs. And all of a sudden, our ability to reach out and provide acute care is dramatically expanded. And I think that's exciting.
What came to my mind as you were spelling it out for us, was what you're asking of us I wrote down the word recognize as you were talking, that we should be recognizing a fellow traveler on the planet is in some distress, to recognize. And what you're asking of us is a level of compassion, the ability to listen, and also to, in some cases, assist in directing them to other sources or resources. Am I on the right track?
I think you covered 3 of the 4 bases. The one base that I tend to emphasize, and you are right, my colleagues and I authored the Johns Hopkins Guide to Psychological First Aid. And what makes the Johns Hopkins approach a little different is that we do develop technologies and employ technologies to mitigate acute distress rather than just recognizing it and referring it. And there's a simple reason for that. Our model was largely developed in the context of a disaster response intervention. So now what would happen if you recognize somebody and they were in acute distress, not life-threatening, but acute distress? Sometimes you would say, well, I think we should go to the emergency room. Okay, that's fair. But what if the emergency room is underwater? What if the emergency room is on fire? What if when you call 911, the lines are down? No one picks up. Is it reasonable that in a situation like that, emergency personnel will be doing other things and that your issue may be of low priority? So the model that we developed, I think, is unique in that we try to actually do something in the field other than recognize, listen, recognize, and refer, if you will. And we have done a number of studies to test, is that even plausible? Because some had said that's not even reasonable. And yet we have seen that it does indeed have some effectiveness.
What is that piece that I have left out of the equation?
Well, we call it the mitigation piece.
And what is that?
Well, it will vary. It will vary. So, for example, if someone says to you, I am so distressed that I am going to quit my job, leave my marriage, move across country, I mean, dramatic life changes. The first and foremost thing that we would recommend is delay. Delay that decision. Now, some people would actually say, well, that's dumb. Why would you want to move across country? Why would you want to quit your job? And you inadvertently start an argument. Aristotle many years ago told us, if you want to have someone change their point of view and adopt your point of view, don't argue with them. First, align with them. So if I could say to you, you say to me, George, I'm thinking about leaving my job. I'm really distressed. And I might say to you, Dennis, leaving your job may be an option. I don't know. I don't know what's best for you. You know what I do know, Dennis? I do know that people make bad decisions when they're highly stressed. And you've already told me you're highly distressed. I wonder if it would be wise to maybe delay that decision for a while. So that's the first mitigational tool. Another mitigational tool is some people will say, I'm having these strange reactions. Why am I having these strange reactions? Well, sometimes you'd be surprised what we can explain through the lens of something called the fight or flight response. Stress. The endocrinologist Hans Selye many years ago, almost 100 years ago, coined the term, taking it from physics into biology. And he made a point, as did Walter Cannon, the Nobel laureate, that stress was a survival mechanism. a modicum of increased stress and arousal is actually a really good thing and can in turn coin the term fight or flight, meaning under some degree of stress, you actually will fight for your life more effectively, or you will be able to flee with greater agility and speed. Translate that into a common parlance. Have you ever heard the term, and I'm sure you have, getting psyched up? Well, we know that athletes that get psyched up generally do better. Why is that? There's more adrenaline going through the body. That fight or flight response is actually helping them. But you've also heard the term getting psyched out, which means too much of a good thing. So sometimes people want to know, why am I having these weird feelings? And you know what? All they want to know is that they're not going to die, they're not going crazy. And sometimes we can provide just some reassurance. So our first intervention might be delay, our second intervention might be reassurance. My favorite, however, I borrow from Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic philosophers. There is no such thing as reality absent your perspective of it. So what we find with many people is they see the world through a lens that continually tells them the glass is half empty. Interestingly enough, the glass might be half full. Which is it? They're both correct, but psychologically, which one you choose matters. Albert Bandura at Stanford University spent 40 years of his career studying this belief in agency. If you see the glass as half full, you will generally be more successful and happier in life than if you consistently see the glass as half empty. So part of what we do in this mitigation component is say, is there another way of viewing this? When I was teaching, I had a visiting professorship in Hong Kong, and a student came up and wrote in Mandarin on the board the term crisis. And he consisted of two symbols, one meaning danger, one meaning possibility. And I thought, oh my, okay. Well, most people, and it's called the negative dominance, most people are wired to be negatively dominant, to see the world negatively, to be pessimistic. It's a survival mechanism, neuroscientists tell us. About 20%, maybe 30% of us are wired to see the world as positive. We're optimists. Here's the good news. The pessimist can learn to be optimists. And that's what we try to do.
We obviously want to advocate taking care of ourselves, self-care, during this pandemic. A point that you make is that helping others helps us. I think that that's an important note, that as we come to the end of our time, that you take a minute out and stress that during this pandemic. Helping others actually helps us.
So we've heard probably for our whole lives, it's a noble endeavor to help someone else in distress. We are all connected. And I think that is true. The usual answer for why do you do that is A, it's the right thing to do, and it makes you feel better. It makes you feel good. So we have actually discovered that there seems to be something more. It seems to be protective. That just learning to help others is protective. And a study was done that actually followed people who took a psychological first aid course and followed them for a year and measured burnout, just exhaustion, physical and mental exhaustion, as well as something called vicarious trauma, being traumatized from the traumas of someone else. And while we found that over the course of that year, exposure to bad things increased, the impact was muted. So it was almost like a psychological immunity that seemed to be derived from learning to help others and helping others, which I think was fascinating.
It is fascinating and so helpful to us during this stressful period of time. Dr. Everly, this has just been a wonderful conversation. It's a thrill to talk with you. And I hope that some point in our programming, we can resume the conversation again. Thank you, Doctor, so much.
I would look forward to it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. If you are in crisis or know someone who is, these resources offer immediate help. For information about This Is America and the World, visit our website, thisisamericatv.net, or our YouTube channel, This Is America TV, and follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Underwriting for This Is America and the World is made possible by the National Association for Children of Addiction, Faces and Voices of Recovery, the Forerunner Foundation, the Rotondaro Family Trust, the Sultanate of Oman, the Kingdom of Morocco, and the Embassy Series, Uniting People Through Musical Diplomacy.